Welcome back, horror fans. It's great to see ya. Today, we're having a look at a list of horror games for Sega's infamous battery-munching handheld, the Game Gear. Back in the 90s, when Sega and Nintendo were in direct competition, Nintendo saw massive success with the release of the Game Boy. Sega wanted a piece of the action, and they tried to one-up Nintendo by releasing a handheld that was far more powerful. The Game Gear featured colorful 8-bit graphics and had a backlit screen that was praised by critics. However, due to the short battery life and a lack of support from Sega, the Game Gear would only sell 10.5 million units, whereas the Game Boy would sell over 118 million worldwide. Sadly, the Game Gear would be discontinued only 7 years after its release. But despite the system's short lifespan, there were a ton of exceptional games released, and some of them were horror games. So, let's kick back, relax, and have a look at the small yet fascinating world of horror on Sega's Game Gear. Up first, we have an absolute classic. Get ready to play Psychic World. Psycho World is a 1988 action platforming video game with sci-fi elements and horror undertones. It was developed by the Hertz Company and was originally released in Japan on the MSX2. In 1991, a Japanese developer called Senritsu Denki ported the game to both the Master System and Game Gear. The name was changed to Psychic World, and the graphics and levels were redesigned to run on different hardware. The game begins with an impressive cutscene. The story follows twin sisters Cecile and Lucia, who both work as lab assistants for a brilliant scientist named Dr. Navik. Together, the team is researching ESP and how humans may be able to harness it and use it in modern technology. One day, while Lucia was getting ready for work, she heard a sudden explosion from the lab. When Lucia goes to investigate, she finds the lab in ruins. A frantic Dr. Navik explains that he's secretly been creating and experimenting on monsters, and that all of his experiments had just escaped. To make matters worse, Lucia discovers that her twin sister Cecile was kidnapped during the breakout. Now, it's up to Lucia to track down the monsters and rescue her sister. Before Lucia pursues the monsters, Dr. Navik equips her with the ESP booster, a device he created that enables the user to wield numerous psychic ESP powers. The gameplay is a classic mix of 2D platforming and run-and-gun shooting. As Lucia, you must navigate your way through a supernatural world infested with monsters and track down your twin sister. Each level features numerous platforming sections as well as a mini-boss midway through. At the end of each level, you must then defeat a stage boss. Your ESP booster can acquire different abilities and upgrades as you defeat different bosses throughout each level. Your ESP booster is first and foremost a weapon, but it could also be a handy tool. For example, one of the ESP abilities lets you destroy rocks that are blocking your path. There's a different ability that allows you to freeze water vapor in midair to create platforms to jump off. Now this game may seem like a Mega Man clone at first glance, but actually it's an extremely unique and competent game. Psychic World is truly a hidden gem and one that I'd highly recommend checking out. It's very affordable too. On PriceStarting.com, a loose copy is only worth $16. Up next, we have a game based on a long-forgotten cartoon cat from the 90s. Let's play Bonkers Wax Up. This obscure 2D platformer came to the Game Gear in 1995 and was developed by Al Baker and Associates. Bonkers Wax Up is based on the animated TV show of the same name. This was a cartoon that Disney made back in 1993. The show only lasted for 2 seasons, but in this short time span, surprisingly, it spawned 3 different video games, including one for the Sega Genesis and one for the Super NES. The game's plot follows the toon cop, Bonkers, as he attempts to rescue his partner as well as several other toons who have all been encased in wax statues by an evil villainess named Madam Who Said It. As Bonkers, you must explore a massive wax museum infested with all sorts of different ghosts and ghouls. Enemies include werewolves, mummies, skeletons, and Madam Who Said It's henchmen. Each level is a bit of a scavenger hunt, as you must find a number of clues scattered throughout each stage. As per usual, you must defeat a stage boss at the end of each level. Now, I was actually quite surprised how much fun I had playing Bonkers Wax Up. I actually had a very good experience. But it's not one that I'd recommend to the casual gamer. Despite being a competent platformer, I think most gamers will lose interest after the first level, as the gameplay is very repetitive. This game would have been a lot easier to digest had the developers incorporated some cutscenes throughout the game in between levels. I will, however, give the developers extra points for choosing the Wax Museum as the setting. I personally find wax statues to be very unsettling, and I've always maintained that wax museums are exceptional backdrops for horror stories. For those interested, Bonkers Wax Up is more than affordable. On PriceStarting.com, a loose copy will only set you back $10. Up next, we have a sci-fi horror classic. Welcome to Alien Syndrome. Alien Syndrome is a run-and-gun shooter that was developed by a company called Sims. This classic graced the arcades way back in 1987. The following year, Alien Syndrome was ported to numerous consoles, including the NES, ZX Spectrum, and of course, the Master System. Four years after the game's original inception, the Game Gear would receive its own unique version of Alien Syndrome. Now, many people mistake this game as simply another port, but really, the Game Gear version is a sequel and takes place 5 years after the events of the original. Once again, protagonists Ricky and Mary are given the dangerous mission to rescue a number of hostages who have been abducted by alien invaders. The original Alien Syndrome and its many ports saw the player visiting different space colonies for each level. However, on the Game Gear version, all 4 levels take place on a massive spacecraft, a transport ship called the De Gaulle. Despite being a sequel, the Game Gear version is pretty much the exact same as its predecessors, almost to a T. Each level sees the player exploring a large maze-like section of the De Gaulle. Once you have rescued a certain number of hostages, you can then move on to face the stage boss. Now you only have a few minutes to complete each stage, so you have to move fast. As you explore each level, you will be attacked by numerous aliens. Now some of these enemies are straight from the original, but there are also many new enemy alien sprites, which adds to the feeling of this being a new sequel and not just a port. As I mentioned earlier, the end of each stage sees the player facing off with a monstrous mini-boss. These boss fights are some of my favorite parts of the game. The developers got very creative with their designs of the boss sprites. As you can see, they're quite disgusting and grotesque. Some of these bosses can be a bit tricky at first, but once you figure out their patterns, they're pretty easy to beat. All in all, Alien Syndrome is an absolute must-play for the Game Gear. The developer Sims did a great job of bringing an arcade classic to a handheld device. My only complaint is that there wasn't a 2-player option available, despite the Game Gear featuring link cable support. Now this horror gem was unfortunately never released in North America, but the Game Gear is not region locked. On Priceturn.com, a loose Japanese copy is worth $40, while the PAL version goes for only $16.21. Up next, we have a game based on a franchise that has always straddled the line between action and horror. Welcome to Jurassic Park. This famous film needs no introduction, but in case you've been living under a rock the last 30 years, Jurassic Park is a 1993 science fiction action film directed by Steven Spielberg. Set on a fictional island near Costa Rica, scientists have resurrected extinct dinosaurs, all so they can be part of a wildlife theme park. Knowing that the book was clearly meant to be a sci-fi horror, I recently rewatched the original Jurassic Park. And despite the book apparently being much darker, I must admit, there really is some unnerving scenes throughout the film. Rewatching the movie made me want to replay different 8-bit Jurassic Park video games. I always thought that Dino Crisis was the first game to combine dinosaurs and horror, but maybe Dino Crisis wasn't the first dino-themed horror game after all. While the versions for the NES and Game Boy are quite tame and actually kind of boring if I'm going to be honest, the versions released on the Game Gear and Master System captured some of the darker undertones and white-knuckle action that was featured in the movie. Jurassic Park made its way to the Game Gear in late 1993. It was both published and developed by Sega. The developers at Sega clearly spared no expense when creating this masterpiece. The game begins with an impressive cutscene. The beautiful video provides a quick recap of the movie and then outlines your missions that you must complete throughout the game. Personally, I always loved this intro. The graphics are top-notch and the music is awesome. It really showcases the power of the Game Gear and just how much more powerful it was than other handhelds of that era. In total, there's 4 levels that can be completed in any order. Once all 4 have been beaten, you're then given access to the 5th and final stage. Each stage begins with a driving/shooting sequence where the player must defend a moving vehicle as it attempts to outrun a dinosaur. Now, this was one of the most iconic scenes in the movie, so I see why they incorporated it into the game. But I think it was a big mistake including them at the start of each level. In my opinion, the developer should have focused on having one well-done driving section that was its own independent level. After completing the driving sequences, the player must then proceed on foot and navigate their way through the level. There is some platforming sections, but most of the game revolves around simply dispatching different dinosaurs that attempt to attack you as you side-scroll your way from left to right. At the end of each level, you must then defeat and capture the stage boss. Each boss fight is unique, as there's a different dinosaur for each level that must be defeated. These bosses include a Triceratops, a Pterodactyl, a Brachiosaurus, a Velociraptor, and of course, a T-Rex for the final boss. I had an amazing time playing Jurassic Park on the Game Gear. The graphics are nice to look at, and the gameplay is fun and user-friendly. The game's a bit on the short side, but I've never expected handheld games to be very long experiences anyway, so that didn't bother me. On PriceCharting.com, a loose copy of Jurassic Park is worth $10. This is one that I would highly recommend checking out. Next up, we have the Addams Family. Based on the 1991 film of the same name, this 2D platformer was originally released for the Genesis and the Super NES, but would later be ported to numerous other consoles. In 1994, Arc Developments brought this classic to the Game Gear. All versions of this game are very similar and loosely follow the plot of the first movie. A brainwashed Uncle Fester and his new greedy stepmother, a woman called Abigail Craven, scheme to steal the Addams Family secret fortune. The entire family has been kidnapped, and now it's up to the family patriarch, Gomez, to rescue his loved ones and help his brother Fester regain his lost memories. The Addams Family consists of non-linear 2D platforming. As Gomez, you must explore different parts of the Addams Family estate. Most of the game is standard platforming, but certain sections do require you to find hidden items and solve rudimentary puzzles. Throughout the game, there are several mini-bosses that must be defeated in order to rescue each member of the Addams Family. Now, this version of the Addams Family is certainly a decent port. The graphics are great and the gameplay is pretty competent. and it's probably worth checking out if you're a fan of the Addams Family franchise. But it's not one that I'd widely recommend, as the gameplay can be a bit frustrating, and the constant loop of the Addams Family theme song quickly gets tedious. But if you're interested, on PriceCharting.com, a loose copy is worth $15.52. Up next, we have a game that we've seen on this channel more than once in the past. Let's play Bram Stoker's Dracula. Bram Stoker's Dracula is of course based on the 1992 film of the same name. It was directed by Francis Ford Coppola and had a star-studded cast including Keanu Reeves, the beautiful Winona Ryder, Anthony Hopkins, and Gary Oldman, who did an outstanding job portraying Dracula in a way audiences had never seen before. Bram Stoker's Dracula, the video game, came out in 1993 across multiple platforms. The 16 and 8-bit versions were all platforming games, whereas the versions for the Sega CD and Amiga were action beat-em-ups that contained cutscenes that were straight from the movie. The Game Gear and Master System versions have the most in common, but the ports for the NES and Game Boy are also very similar, as all four were made in conjunction by developers Psygnosis and Probe Software. Once again, you play as protagonist Jonathan Harker and must escape Dracula's castle. Each level sees the player navigating their way through simple platforming sections, while they'll encounter different monsters including ghosts, skeletons, zombies, and of course, vampires. As Jonathan, you have a close quarters melee attack, and begin each stage with a knife. But throughout each level, you have the chance to upgrade and acquire new weapons, such as torches, axes, or throwing knives. At the end of each stage, you must then defeat a mini-boss. These enemies can be tricky at first, but as per usual, once you learn their patterns, they're quite easy to defeat. The critics didn't like any versions of this game, and the 8-bit versions didn't receive much love either. At first, I wasn't a big fan myself, but over the years, they've kind of grown on me. In my opinion, the worst part of the 8-bit versions are the boxes with the question marks. These silly boxes seem very out of place for what's supposed to be a scary game. Whenever I see them, I'm instantly reminded of Mario, and that kind of breaks the horror ambiance. Bram Stoker's Dracula isn't a game that I'd recommend to the casual gamer, but if you're a horror fan, it's definitely worth checking out. On PriceCharting.com, a loose copy is worth $13. Up next, we have a game that some may be surprised to see on this list. But trust me, I have my reasons. Welcome to The Simpsons. Bart versus the Space Mutants. This 2D platformer was developed by a company called Imagineering and was originally released for the NES in 1991, but would eventually make its way to just about every console under the sun, including the Game Gear in 1992. You of course play as preteen badass Bartholomew Jojo Simpson as he attempts to stop an alien invasion that is taking place in Springfield. Now, many people wouldn't consider Bart vs. the Space Mutants to be a horror game, but at its core, the entire game is actually a parody of the John Carpenter horror classic, They Live. They Live is a sci-fi horror film that stars former pro wrestler Roddy Piper, who plays an unnamed drifter that has made the shocking discovery that the upper class are actually aliens concealing their true form and have been controlling the masses with subliminal messages through the media.
It's a new morning in America. Fresh, vital. The old cynicism is gone.
The protagonist of the film discovers these aliens with special X-ray sunglasses that allow whoever wears them to see the aliens in their true, horrific form.
Need pessimism. There are no limits.
It figures we'd do something like this.
As you can see, They Live and Bart vs. the Space Mutants have many things in common. Bart is the only one in town that actually knows what's going on, and only Bart, using his X-ray glasses, can confirm who's human and who is secretly an alien. Most of the game is kind of a scavenger hunt. Bart must prevent the aliens from collecting certain items needed to build their doomsday weapon. The first level's a bit different though. The aliens, for some reason, need purple colored items for their doomsday device. As Bart, you must go around Springfield and find any items that are purple and paint them red or cover them up. Throughout the game, different people will approach Bart. When this happens, he can put on his X-ray specs and check to see if they're an alien. When you encounter one, you can dispatch them by jumping on their head. Finding and destroying aliens is optional, but it is highly recommended, as each one you kill unlocks letters that will eventually spell out the names of Homer, Marge, Lisa, and Maggie. Each time you unlock a member of the Simpsons family, they will then assist Bart during a boss battle. But if you attack someone that's actually human, the game will penalize you by taking away a life. All in all, Bart vs. the Space Mutants is actually a pretty fun game. I was shocked to find out that this was the first Simpsons game ever made, and the developers were quite ambitious. It's a bit on the difficult side, so I wouldn't recommend it to the casual gamer, but if you're interested, on PriceCharting.com, a loose copy is worth $11. Up next, we have a game based on a famous horror movie sequel. Let's play Predator 2. Predator 2 is a 1990 sci-fi horror movie. It was directed by Stephen Hopkins and starred Danny Glover, who gave a phenomenal performance portraying a gritty Los Angeles cop investigating a string of homicides. Eventually, he's faced with the horrifying reality that the culprit isn't just a serial killer, but is actually an alien hunter from a different world. For me, Predator 2 was one of the first movies I ever saw where I thought the sequel was better than the original. The fan base is split on which movie is better, but fans of the original will often preach that the first film has a more terrifying setting, as Arnold is isolated in the jungle with nothing but a knife. But personally, I've always found the sequel to be far more unnerving. Not only was there more violence and gore, but as you watch the Predator's reign of terror, it quickly becomes apparent that it doesn't matter where you are. If the Predator has you in his sights, nowhere is safe. Not even the city. Two years after the movie's release, Predator 2 came to the Game Gear and Master System. A 16-bit version was also released for the Sega Genesis, but had a different developer. The Game Gear version was made by a developer called Teeny Weeny Games. It features several levels from the movie, including the streets of LA, the rooftops, and the subway. The gameplay has an over-the-head perspective, where you must scroll from left to right. You will be under constant attack from gang members. You start each level with a handgun that has unlimited ammo. But throughout the game, you have the opportunity to pick up different weapons that enemies will drop. Each level also has a number of hostages that must be rescued. Failure to rescue the hostages in a timely manner will result in the predator shooting you with his tri-laser. This can happen at any point throughout the level. The final stage takes place on a spacecraft. Here, you must battle numerous predator aliens before facing the final boss. Now, although I'm a huge fan of Predator 2 the movie, I can't say the same about the game. Despite the gameplay being fairly competent, I just found it boring. I also think it was a big mistake not including the Predator in the earlier levels. I think this game was a huge missed opportunity to make a simple run-and-gun shooter similar to Contra. Those games are always fun, and really you can't mess them up. I probably wouldn't recommend Predator 2 to the casual gamer, but it might be worth checking out if you're a diehard fan of the franchise. On PriceCharting.com, a loose copy is worth $25. Next up, we have an absolute Game Gear classic. Get ready to play Devilish. In 1976, Atari released the iconic arcade game Breakout. This simple yet addicting game revolved around destroying a layer of bricks at the top of the screen. Breakout was a massive hit that inspired many clones, the most popular of which was Taito's 1986 arcade classic, Arkanoid. I've always loved these kind of games, and have always referred to this genre as paddle games, but in Japan, there's an actual name for this genre. They're called Block Kuzushi, which translates to block breaker. In 1991, a developer called Opera House breathed new life into the genre with the release of Devilish. This horror-themed paddle game was exclusive to the Game Gear and was perfect to play on the go. The simple graphics and gameplay worked well on a handheld interface. The story follows a prince and princess who have fallen in love, but a lonely demon who was jealous of their bliss has transformed the royal lovebirds into a pair of stone paddles. Now, the prince and princess must defeat the demon and his army of monsters. Players must navigate vertically scrolling levels with two stone paddles. The upper one is used to defeat enemies and change the direction of the ball, while the lower paddle's main purpose is to act as a backup and prevent the ball from dropping off the screen, which will cost you a life. Each level is full of different monsters and demonic creatures. Some are stationary, while others move around the screen. Being a Breakout-inspired game, there's also, of course, numerous walls of blocks that must be destroyed in order to move on. Some of these blocks contain power-ups, such as additional lives or bombs. Certain levels have mini-bosses that must be defeated at the end of the stage. These monsters' avatars have detailed sprites. For the most part, they're stationary, but some of them do move around a bit. These terrifying creatures remind me of the mini-bosses in the Pinball Crush series, especially Devil's Crush. For the most part, Devilish is a pretty simple game. In fact, an experienced player can easily beat all 8 stages in under half an hour. But certain levels do have frustrating sections. Some parts require the player to invert the top paddle and force the ball horizontally. You only have a couple of minutes to finish each stage, so these parts where you must navigate your way through many changes in direction can be a bit tricky, as it's easy to get caught in a bounce loop where the ball gets caught between 2 walls and ricochets non-stop. In general, Devilish can be a bit tricky, but once you figure out the different configurations of the dual paddles, you'll be hauling ball in no time. Eventually, Devilish went on to have a sequel on the Mega Drive called Bad Omen. Its name was changed to Devilish: The Next Possession for the North American Genesis release. The sequel featured exceptional 16-bit graphics as well as a 2-player mode where each person had control of a paddle each. Years later, in 2005, a third title was released on the DS called Devilish Ball Bouncer. This version wasn't nearly as popular as its predecessors, but was still a competent title that made good use of the DS's twin screens. Devilish is easily one of my favorite games available on the Game Gear. This classic is one that I highly recommend checking out. Both the horror fan and casual gamer will enjoy this one. On PriceCharting.com, a loose copy is worth $29.99. Up next, we have an absolute classic. Get ready for Wizard Pinball. This European exclusive was released in 1995 and was developed by a studio called Teak London. The 90s was an era that was extremely oversaturated with pinball games, and handheld systems were home to some real bangers, such as Kirby's Pinball on the Game Boy, or Sonic Spinball, which was also available on the Game Gear. So when I heard about a horror-themed pinball game exclusive to the Game Gear, I knew I had to check it out. Wizard Pinball has one multi-tier table with multiple sets of flippers. It's very similar to games like Devil Crush or Alien Crush. Throughout the game, different enemies will bounce around the screen. These monsters will rotate through, but the first one's a ghost. There's also 3 secret mini-tables hidden throughout the game. When you find these secrets, you'll have the chance to play and defeat mini-bosses. The graphics in Wizard Pinball are top-notch, and the gameplay is challenging, but not so hard where it stops being fun. The pinball physics aren't perfect, but they're pretty good considering it's an old 90s handheld game. Once again, the Game Gear is region-free, so you can import Wizard Pinball if you're interested. The price, however, is not cheap. On PriceCharting.com, a loose copy is worth $55. Due to the steep price, Wizard Pinball isn't a game that I'd recommend buying, but if you're a little tech savvy, Game Gear emulators are easy to get running on PCs. Up next, we are having a look at the best game I guarantee you've never heard of. Get ready to play Demon Child Zenki. Demon Child Zenki is an action horror platforming game. It is based on a popular Japanese manga of the same name that later became an anime in the 90s. The story follows a girl named Chiaki Ino, who is the descendant of a sorcerer called Uzuno. Ozuno once defeated a demon goddess called Kuruma. Using sorcery, Ozuno was able to summon other demon gods to fight and destroy the demon goddess. After defeating Kuruma, Ozuno sealed away a powerful demon god called Zenki in case Kuruma should ever return. Centuries later, Kuruma has resurrected herself, along with her demonic seeds that transform people into hideous monsters. Since Chiaki is Ozuno's direct descendant and a sorcerer in training, she's able to free and summon the demon god Zenki to help her in her battle against evil. However, the first time they meet, Zenki attempts to kill Chiaki. Upon his release, he feels betrayed for being in prison for so long, especially since he helped Ozuno in the past. So, in an attempt to make Zenki more docile, Chiaki uses her abilities and transforms Zenki into a bratty kid. Thus, the name of the franchise, which loosely translates to Demon Child Zenki. Each episode follows Zenki and Chiaki as they travel around, hunting and destroying demon seeds who have changed people into monsters. The majority of the show follows Zenki in his child form. However, should the two of them ever get in over their heads, Chiaki can transform Zenki back into his adult form using her magic. This beloved anime eventually spawned 5 different video games, all loosely based on the TV show. The Game Gear version came out in 1995 and was made by Sega's in-house development team, Sega CS5. The game starts off with another impressive cutscene. Once again, this really showcases the absolute power of the Game Gear. Here in the first video, we're introduced to our two protagonists, Chiaki and Zenki. Now, this game was a Japanese exclusive, so the text will be unreadable unless you speak the language, but there are English translation patches available. That's what you're seeing here. Rest assured though, if you have a Japanese version, the language barrier doesn't prevent you from being able to play and enjoy the game. After the intro video, we're thrown directly into our first boss fight. The majority of the game are platforming levels where you can play as Chiaki or Zenki in his child form, but the exciting boss battles have a much different interface. It's more of a one-on-one street fight where you can use melee attacks or various elemental magic attacks. For the boss fights, Chiaki also transforms Zenki back into his adult form, as he's far more powerful in this state. After defeating each boss, they will then revert back into a demon seed. Between levels, the game features an overworld map. When you click on a level, you're then given the option to play as Chiaki or Zenki. Certain levels have sections that can only be completed by Zenki, whereas certain items can only be obtained using Chiaki. Due to this interesting mechanic, you will sometimes have to backtrack and exit the level so you can switch characters. The gameplay for each character is quite a bit different. Chiaki can find scrolls that give her the ability to cast different magical spells. Chiaki's spells can be used to attack enemies and can also be used to access areas that Zenki can't. Unlike Chiaki, Zenki can only use magic when he's in his adult form. In his child form, Zenki plays much like Sonic the Hedgehog. He can spin into a ball to attack enemies, and can also access hard-to-reach places, as he's much shorter. Now, on a surface level, Demon Child Zenki is a pretty cute game. I think if one was to play a platforming stage, they wouldn't think that it's a horror title. But trust me, everything changes when the boss fights happen. The music, the cutscenes, and overall vibe massively change when these boss fights take place. Each stage boss is weird and unique in their own way. Each fight begins with a top-notch cutscene where we're introduced to our next terrifying foe. All in all, Demon Child Zenki is an absolute must-play game. This is one that I would highly recommend to both horror fans and the casual gamer. Unfortunately, this hidden gem is not cheap. On PriceCharting.com, a loose Japanese copy of Demon Child Zenki is worth $53.36. For those interested, there's also English translation ROM hacks that you can buy on eBay. Typically, they go for around $60. Before we have a look at the final 3 horror games, I wanted to give an honorable mention to a brand new homebrew called Dracula no Shiro, aka Dracula's Castle. Dracula no Shiro is an aftermarket homebrew that was originally released for the Game Boy back in 2019. It was developed by a Japanese studio called Habitsoft and published by a company called Game Impact. In 2021, Dracula no Shiro was ported to the Game Gear and Master System, although it was redesigned to take advantage of the more powerful hardware. The story follows an unnamed protagonist whose girlfriend, Princess Psycho, has been kidnapped by Dracula. Now, you must enter Dracula's castle and rescue Princess Psycho. The gameplay is super simple and has a very retro vibe. Each stage has 3 chests that are scattered throughout the room. One chest will always contain a mummy that will chase you down as soon as it's been released. Another chest will always have a weapon, which is usually a knife. The third and final chest will have a random pickup or power-up, such as an additional life. These are left behind by Princess Psycho. Once each chest has been opened, you can then move on to the next level. The gameplay and concept may be a bit simple and basic, but I think it's awesome that there's still developers creating games for the Game Gear. In recent years, the Game Boy has had a gold rush of homebrew games, but the homebrew scene seems to have forgotten about the Game Gear. For those interested, you can buy loose copies of Dracula no Shiro on eBay or Alibaba for around $60. The publisher, Game Impact, also has a website online where there's many other aftermarket homebrews available. However, most of the sites in Japanese, and if I'm not mistaken, they don't ship their products outside of Japan. But it's still a pretty cool website, and I definitely recommend checking it out. Up next, we have yet another game based on a famous horror movie franchise. Let's play Alien 3. Alien 3 is a sci-fi horror game based on the 1992 film of the same name. Released a year after the movie and developed by Probe Software, Alien 3 eventually made its way to just about every console around. With the exception of the Game Boy version, every other port is nearly identical.
Was there an alien on board?
For those that haven't seen the film, Alien 3 takes place directly after the events of Aliens 2. Ripley's ship has crash-landed on a planet that was formerly a prison colony. Ripley was the only survivor, or so she thought. It turns out, an alien stowaway was on board as well. The film wasn't well received upon its release, but over the years, Alien 3 has developed a die-hard cult following, especially among David Fincher fans, as Alien 3 was actually his feature directorial debut. Alien 3 is a non-linear run-and-gun shooter. Your mission for each level is similar to Alien Syndrome, as you must simply find and rescue inmates who have been taken hostage by the aliens. The large, maze-like stages can be tricky to navigate, and some of the hostages can be quite well hidden too. Unfortunately, there's no map, so I'd recommend using one off the internet if you're serious about beating the entire game, as you only have a few minutes to complete each level. You of course play as Ellen Ripley. As you can see, Ripley is sporting a shaved head, just like in the film. But that is pretty much all the movie has in common with the game. In the movie, there's only one alien, and Ripley has no weapons to defend herself. However, in the game, there's aliens hiding around every corner, and Ripley suddenly has access to numerous weapons, including a flamethrower, a grenade launcher, and a pulse rifle. Really, the game has more in common with its predecessor, Aliens 2. Despite the fact that Alien 3 is only loosely based on the movie, it's still an exceptional game and a must-play for horror fans. This is one that I would highly recommend checking out. On PriceCharting.com, a loose copy of Alien 3 is worth $19. The second last game on our list is one of my personal favorites. Let's play Chakan, the Forever Man. Chakan, the Forever Man was first released for the Sega Genesis in 1992. This horror classic is based on a comic book of the same name. Chakan the Forever Man was created by a writer named Robert A. Krause. The game's producer, a man named Ed Annunziata, was at a comic book convention one day where he met the creator. He loved the character and thought the concept would translate well to a video game. The rest is history. The story follows a legendary warrior named Chakan, who believes he can defeat any opponent in the world, even death himself. Insulted by Chakan's arrogance, Death appears and challenges Chakan to a duel. The Grim Reaper guarantees Chakan eternal life should he best Death in battle. Chakan agrees, and the two enter into a gruesome battle that seems to go on for days. But, to Death's surprise, in the end, it is indeed Chakan who is victorious. Chakan demands that Death keep his word and grant him immortality. Death obliges and gives the warrior eternal life. However, the Grim Reaper would still have the last laugh, as he then explains that Chakan is now Death's eternal servant, and is cursed to live as a monstrous shell of his former self. The only way Chakan will ever know Death's sweet embrace is if he destroys all supernatural evil on the planet. Only then will Chakan know peace. The original version for the Genesis was developed by Extended Play Productions, but the Game Gear port was contracted out to a programmer named Paul Hutchinson, who pretty much developed the entire game all by himself. As Chakan, you have a hub world where you can access each stage by entering a portal. There is 6 different levels available that can be played in any order. Each level has multiple segments that end with a boss fight. Throughout the game, you will face numerous monsters and other deadly creatures. You must also navigate your way through complex platforming sections, where you must make precise jumps and pinpoint exactly where you land. This game is not easy. Let me make one thing clear. Chakan the Forever Man is for veteran platformers. There's 3 levels of difficulty: Wicked, Deadly, and Mental. But even on the easiest option, Wicked, the game can be very frustrating and extremely unforgiving. To make matters worse, the only way to access the final stage is to play the game on Deadly or Mental, which is not an easy feat. The gameplay in the Game Gear port is very similar to the version on the Genesis, but level layout and other changes were made as the Game Gear hardware was far less powerful. The Game Gear version does, however, feature a synthesized voice at the intro screen. This was an impressive bonus that the original did not have. I always have a fun time playing Chakan the Forever Man, whether it's on the Game Gear or the Genesis. If you're a horror fan, Chakan the Forever Man is an absolute must-play game. However, I wouldn't recommend it to the casual gamer, as the gameplay is just too difficult and unforgiving. On PriceCharting.com, a loose copy is worth $13.20. Well, horror fans, here we are on the very last game. Once again, we have saved the best for last. Welcome to Master of Darkness. Throughout the 8-bit era, Nintendo saw massive success with the release of several Castlevania games for both the NES and Game Boy. Sega wanted a piece of the action, but instead of spending a fortune on the license to create their own Castlevania game, Sega opted to save some money and just make their very own vampire title. And just like that, a classic was born. Welcome to Master of Darkness, the best vampire game that you've never heard of. Master of Darkness was created by a developer called Sims. It was obvious that Sega wanted Master of Darkness to replicate the same vibe and experience that gamers got from Castlevania. But Sims went above and beyond and created a game that was far more than just another Castlevania clone. Master of Darkness was released for the Game Gear in October of 1992, 1 week before Halloween. The next year, the Master System would receive its own port, although this version was only available in Europe. Taking place in 19th century England, the game's story follows a Ouija board playing doctor named Ferdinand Social. He is a paranormal investigator who has discovered evidence that links the victims of Jack the Ripper to a cult that's been using the murdered woman's blood as part of a dark resurrection ceremony to bring back Dracula. The adventure begins when Dr. Social receives a cryptic message through his Ouija board. The message warns of something evil taking place at Thames River. Trusting his instincts, our protagonist goes to investigate. The first level begins with an impressive cutscene that details the start of our story. This cryptic intro hints at the involvement of none other than Jack the Ripper. As you can see, the graphics and gameplay in Master of Darkness are heavily inspired by Castlevania. The similarities are clear as day. As Social, you side-scroll your way across each level, fighting numerous monsters and other creatures of the night. You begin the game with only a knife, but you'll have numerous opportunities throughout each stage to upgrade to different weapons, such as an axe, a cane, or a sword. There's also secondary projectile weapons that can be collected. These include a boomerang, a handgun, and wooden throwing stakes. The gameplay and movement of your character is far more user-friendly in Master of Darkness than other Castlevania games of the 8-bit era. You can move left, right, and of course jump. The biggest difference is the fact that you can now duck down and move around crouching, something that you could not do in any previous Castlevania titles. Movement going up and down sets of stairs has always been one of my biggest pet peeves in the Castlevania series. It's just really annoying. Master of Darkness hasn't improved this mechanic very much, and honestly it's still kind of a pain in the ass, but you do now have the option to jump off stairwells midway, which is a nice bonus as you were unable to do this in previous Castlevania games. At the end of each level, you must then defeat a stage boss. These boss fights can be tricky, but for the most part, are fairly easy to beat, especially if you ensure that you have some secondary weapons at your disposal. My favorite is the boomerang. The first boss is of course, Jack the Ripper. Thankfully, the first level and boss fight are pretty easy to beat. The developers made the wise choice to tone down the difficulty for the first stage so players could get a hang of things and have fun while doing so. The game features several cutscenes that take place between each level. These cutscenes aren't anything special, but they do help to drive the story forward and do a great job at maintaining the creepy horror vibe that's present throughout the entire game. Master of Darkness has 5 action-packed levels. Throughout the game, you'll visit locations that include a cemetery, Dracula's castle, and my personal favorite, a wax museum. Each level is divided into 3 stages that get progressively harder as the game goes on. This vampire classic was well received by fans and critics alike. The game's detailed graphics and user-friendly controls were praised by Sega fans across the board. Sega had set out to create a Castlevania experience on the Game Gear, but in the end had created something way better. Now, don't get me wrong, Master of Darkness doesn't hold a candle next to future 16-bit Castlevania games, but in my opinion, MOD is way better than any of the Castlevania games available on the NES or Game Boy. After collecting and enjoying so many different horror titles on the Game Gear, Master of Darkness is the clear winner as the best horror game available. On PriceCharting.com, a loose copy is worth $51.99. I had a lot of fun playing Master of Darkness, and honestly, I can't recommend it enough. Casual gamers are sure to have a good time, but horror fans will have an absolute blast. That much I can guarantee. Well, horror fans, that is the end of the video. Thanks so much for watching, it means a lot to me. I hope everyone enjoyed learning about some of the different horror games available on Sega's long forgotten handheld. Until next time, this is Wade from Rare Play Gaming, signing off. I will see everyone in the next one.